They weren't hiding under your bed. They were your neighbors, your doctors, your heroes. Across the past 2 centuries, America has produced a gallery of figures so chilling, their stories blur the line between history and horror. Not legends, not ghosts, real people who smiled in photos, signed documents, tucked their shirts in, and quietly unraveled lives. This isn't a list of villains. It's a study in how terrifying the ordinary can be. These are the 49 most terrifying people in U.S. history, and chances are, one of them lived closer than you think. 1. William Bloody Bill Anderson. There's something especially terrifying about a man whose allies fear him more than their enemies do. William Bloody Bill Anderson didn't earn his nickname from legends whispered after the war. He earned it before lunch. A Confederate guerrilla leader during the American Civil War, Anderson didn't lead so much as he descended. Wherever he went, the ground seemed to rot. He wasn't a soldier. He was a symptom of a country splitting at the seams and pouring out men like him. Anderson operated in Missouri, a border state where the war wasn't about uniforms or declarations, but about who you could kill and still justify it. He preferred irregular warfare, fast, lawless, up close. His band of guerrillas, which at times included a young Jesse James, specialized in ambushes, mutilations, and psychological warfare. Even his Confederate commanders wrote in frightened tones about him, not disapprovingly, but like a man describing a fire he can't control. It was Anderson's 1864 raid on Centralia, Missouri that cemented his legend. There, his men derailed a train, dragged Union soldiers out one by one, and executed them. The ones who tried to run were hunted down. Eyewitnesses said Anderson smiled a lot that day. Even in the retelling, the story doesn't sound like war. It sounds like a ghost story told by people who didn't think ghosts smiled. Anderson died that same year in an ambush by Union forces, shot so many times they had to identify him by his boots and hair. His body was displayed like a trophy, but the real terror was never in his face. It was in how quickly a man could become what he became. Because the war ended, but the need for men like Anderson never really did. They just put on different uniforms and started different fires, and some of them had already gotten a head start. 2. Nathan Bedford Forrest. The Confederate general who started his career as a slave trader and ended it as an early leader of the Ku Klux Klan. Nathan Bedford Forrest was less a man, more a walking indictment of everything America didn't want to admit about itself. Tall, magnetic, and terrifyingly effective, Forrest was described by his peers as a military genius, which would be more impressive if he weren't also a merchant of human beings and the architect of one of the most brutal massacres of the Civil War. At Fort Pillow in 1864, his men overran a garrison of Union troops, many of them black, and slaughtered them even as they tried to surrender. Forrest's name was later carved into statues. His victims were buried in mass graves. After the war, Forrest's story didn't end. It mutated. In the burned-out Reconstruction South, he became something worse than a general, a symbol. As one of the Klan's first grand wizards, Forrest helped transform Confederate defeat into a cult. He may have publicly distanced himself later, but by then it didn't matter. The idea of him had already gone viral. Cities named streets after him. Groups raised money to honor his legacy. And his image became a kind of Southern myth, part folklore, part nightmare. The horror of Nathan Bedford Forrest isn't just what he did. It's how durable his shadow became. Generations later, his statue still stood in parks, casting literal shade. The country he helped rip apart kept choosing to remember him, not as a warning, but as a hero. And maybe that's the most terrifying part, that a man like Forrest didn't just exist. He thrived. And he wasn't the last man in uniform whose home life would hide a much darker war. 3. Jeffrey MacDonald. It had all the ingredients of a perfect American life. Ivy League education, military rank, beautiful wife, 2 adorable daughters, and a suburban home with matching dishware. Jeffrey MacDonald was the kind of man you'd trust with your kids. Until someone actually did. In 1970, MacDonald called military police to report a brutal home invasion at Fort Bragg. His pregnant wife and 2 young daughters were dead. He had stab wounds, but not life-threatening ones. He said drug-crazed hippies had broken in, muttering, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." It sounded like the Manson murders, too much like them. The details never quite added up. No signs of forced entry. No one in the area matching the description. And MacDonald himself? Calm. Clinical. A little too put together for a man whose entire world had allegedly collapsed. Military investigators smelled something off. But MacDonald walked free, at least for a while. It took a decade before he was convicted. 10 years of TV appearances, lawsuits, and media charm offensives. He even wrote a book. In the courtroom, he played doctor, soldier, victim. But the evidence told a different story. Fibers from his shirt under his wife's fingernails, blood evidence inconsistent with his account, and no credible suspects. The jury took just a few hours to decide. To this day, MacDonald maintains his innocence. So do a small number of true crime devotees who believe in the real killer's theory. But the majority opinion is colder, more disquieting, that a man trained to heal, decorated for service, could come home one night and become a monster with a scalpel's precision, and then slip back into the role of husband, father, and all-American professional. Because the scariest killers aren't the ones hiding in the woods, they're the ones who remember to clean the sink. Or Robert Garrow. Robert Garrow was the kind of man who made entire counties sleep with their windows locked, not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. The quiet, creeping terror of someone who looks ordinary, talks ordinary, and lives ordinary, until the moment he doesn't. Born in the Adirondacks, Garrow grew up in poverty, instability, and a level of bitterness that seemed to ferment over time. By adulthood, he had become a drifter with a talent for slipping in and out of small towns without leaving much behind, except rumors. Strange behavior here, odd disappearances there, a general sense that people didn't feel comfortable when he walked into a room. His crimes in the early 1970s sent shockwaves through New York. What terrified people wasn't just the violence, but the unpredictability. Garrow didn't operate like a career criminal with a pattern you could track. Instead, he drifted from one bad choice into another, as if casually stepping across moral boundaries the way others stepped across puddles. Investigators quickly realized they weren't dealing with a mastermind. They were dealing with someone whose impulses had no bottom. The manhunt that followed became one of the largest in state history. Entire communities shut their doors. Campsites emptied overnight. Law enforcement officers patrolled forests usually reserved for hikers and summer vacationers. And Garrow, wounded but determined, hid among the trees like he had been born there. For weeks, the Adirondacks became a character in its own drama, each shadow in the woods holding the possibility that Garrow was watching from behind it. When he was finally captured, it didn't end the fear. His courtroom behavior, his manipulative attempts to twist the narrative, and later his escape attempt from prison all contributed to a legend of a man who simply did not stop. Not when confronted, not when cornered, not even when institutional walls closed around him. Garrow left behind an unease that still lingers. The uncomfortable truth that some people aren't driven by ideology or passion, but by a restlessness that turns dangerous the moment life refuses to go their way. Because if Garrow proved anything, it's that unpredictability is terrifying enough, even before someone decides to use it. And someone else would take unpredictability and inflate it into a personal philosophy. 5. Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram could terrify you without ever raising his voice. In fact, his calmness was part of the horror. He wasn't frantic, wild, or dramatically unhinged. He was composed, articulate, and chillingly self-aware. A criminal whose life read like a travel itinerary through every bad decision a person could make, Panzram left behind an autobiography so disturbingly honest that even hardened prison officials felt rattled reading it. He was born into a world that didn't do him any favors, but plenty of people have had hard beginnings without becoming human hurricanes. Panzram, however, seemed to look at the world early on and decide, nope, I'm opting out of the social contract. His life became a rolling storm of theft, arson, assaults, escapes, and cross-country chaos. If there had been an airline loyalty program for getting arrested, Panzram would have earned platinum status. What truly unnerved people who encountered him was his philosophy. He believed, with the conviction of a preacher and the charm of a salesman, that the world was corrupt and that he was simply responding in kind. He didn't claim to be misunderstood. He claimed to be consistent, and that's what frightened everyone. The idea that a man could look his own destruction in the eye and shrug as if reviewing a weather report. During his many imprisonments, wardens and guards struggled with him. Panzram didn't bluff, didn't soften, and didn't pretend to feel remorse. Yet he wasn't chaotic for chaos's sake. He was methodical. His statements to guards read almost like philosophical essays about human cruelty, except delivered by someone who had made it his personal science experiment. In a strange twist of irony, one of the few people he formed a connection with was a prison guard who treated him like a human being. It was that guard who encouraged Panzram to write his life story, the same story that later left readers and officials wondering how many more people like him had passed through the system unnoticed, their internal storms undocumented. Panzram's legacy isn't a list of crimes. It's a set of questions. What happens when a man decides he owes the world nothing? And what happens when the world decides he might be right? And then there are those who bring the world into their worldview, one bullet at a time. 6. John Muhammad. The year 2002 was already uneasy. But when John Muhammad appeared, or rather, didn't appear, the atmosphere shifted from anxious to suffocating. He was one half of what would become known as the DC Snipers. But Muhammad was the architect, the planner, the mind that turned a series of shootings into a psychological chokehold on an entire region. What made him terrifying wasn't just the violence, it was the randomness, or the appearance of it. People were pumping gas, loading groceries, walking into buildings, all the routine gestures of being alive. And suddenly those gestures felt like risks. Parents zigzagged across parking lots. People crouched behind car doors at gas stations. Schools kept kids indoors. The country hadn't seen anything like this. One man, hidden in plain sight, turning ordinary life into a chessboard where the pieces kept disappearing. Muhammad was a former army marksman, a man with training, discipline, and a simmering anger that had curdled into something toxic. After a messy personal life, custody battles, and a string of unraveling decisions, he seemed to shift into a mode of self-justification where the world had wronged him, and now he was responding with cold precision. What law enforcement struggled with most was the lack of pattern. No personal connections, no messages left behind, no ideological manifesto. Just fear, clean, sharp, and mathematically efficient. Investigators scrambled for leads that seemed to dissolve the moment they appeared. It wasn't until small mistakes emerged, slips in planning, a car, a discarded clue, that the case cracked open. And when Muhammad was caught, the shock wasn't in his capture, it was in how normal he looked. The man who had brought a region to its knees appeared utterly unremarkable, the kind of person you might pass in a parking lot and never notice. That was the real horror, the banality of the architect behind the panic. Muhammad forced an entire country to confront a chilling truth. You don't need an army to wage a psychological war. You just need patience, a plan, and a willingness to feed on fear. But if Muhammad turned the everyday world into a shooting gallery, The next figure proved that terror doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it wears a neighborly smile and files paperwork on time. 7. Dennis Rader, BTK. Dennis Rader was the kind of man you'd trust to water your plants when you were out of town. He volunteered at church, kept his lawn immaculately trimmed, and wrote polite letters to city officials about stray dogs and improper trash bins. On paper, he looked like the blueprint of a reliable neighbor, the sort who remembers your birthday, even if you forget his. And yet, behind that steady suburban exterior was something colder, quieter, and infinitely more unsettling. Rader operated with a patience that made investigators uneasy. He wasn't frantic or sloppy. He wasn't the storm-through-the-window type. He was the check your locks twice, then check the shadows again type. His life was a decades-long game of pretending to be normal, and he was very good at it. What terrified Kansas wasn't just the crimes themselves. It was the long pauses between them. Years would pass with no word from him, and the community would start exhaling again, thinking maybe he'd disappeared, been arrested, moved, aged out. But then a letter would show up, polite, organized, with the tone of a man submitting minutes from a board meeting rather than taunting a city. Rader's double life was a study in contrast. By day, he enforced rules as a city compliance officer, scolding residents for weeds or broken fences. By night, he constructed the persona he named BTK, a title he seemed uncomfortably proud of. He wrote in an oddly formal, almost bureaucratic voice, as if he were filling out crime reports about himself. When he was finally caught, it was due to a technological misunderstanding so mundane it bordered on comedic. He believed that church computers couldn't be traced. They could, and they did. His arrest shattered the illusion of suburban safety, not because he had been hiding in the shadows, but because he had been hiding in the sunshine, barbecues, family portraits, community meetings. The fear Rader left behind wasn't loud or cinematic. It was the quiet dread that the person sitting next to you at a PTA gathering could be living an entire second life behind their polite nods. And that lingering sense of suburban vulnerability only deepens when the next figure steps into the frame, a man whose night of terror didn't unfold over decades, but over hours. 8. Richard Speck. Richard Speck did not arrive in the American consciousness gradually. He crashed into it in a single night that reshaped how the country thought about safety, strangers, and the concept of, "it can't happen here." He was not calculating like Rader, nor ideological like others on this list. Speck was chaos wrapped in a human form, impulsive, volatile, and unreachable once he made up his mind. What made him terrifying wasn't genius or strategy. It was the opposite. A complete disregard for consequences. Speck drifted through life with an aimlessness that should have been harmless, but somehow never was. Each job ended abruptly. Each relationship dissolved with tension. He moved from city to city like a storm front, and people around him often reported a feeling of unease that they couldn't articulate. By 1966, he had the look of a man whose life was unraveling, but who blamed the thread instead of the hand pulling it. His drinking increased. His frustrations simmered. And then came the night that would define him in infamy. What followed was an eruption. A crime so shocking that newspapers debated how much detail to share with the public. The country looked at Speck and realized that danger wasn't always methodical or predictable. Sometimes it was impulsive, angry, and opportunistic. The aftermath changed everything. Women across the country began locking their doors more religiously. Campuses added new safety rules. Dormitories reevaluated late-night policies. There was a national anxiety that someone like Speck could strike anywhere, at any time, without motive or warning. When Speck was finally identified, it wasn't through a dramatic manhunt. It was through the vigilance of a small-town doctor who recognized him from a newspaper. His arrest provided closure, but not relief. People looked at him, hollow-eyed, volatile, unremarkable, and realized how frighteningly ordinary he seemed. Speck's presence in history leaves a bitter lesson. Sometimes the most terrifying figures are not geniuses or masterminds, but people who make catastrophic decisions simply because they feel like it in the moment. And if Speck represented raw chaos, the next figure channeled chaos into something even more devastating, rage mixed with firepower. 9. James Huberty. James Huberty was the man who made America rethink what going out for lunch could mean. Before 1984, the idea of families gathering at a fast food restaurant was as unthreatening as it gets. Bright lighting, plastic booths, paper hats, happy meals. It was the symbol of American normalcy. Huberty walked straight into that world and shattered it. A former welder, Huberty had spent years watching his life erode piece by piece. Jobs vanished. Health concerns grew. His worldview darkened into something resentful and paranoid. He developed a fixation on the idea that government systems were failing him, that society had pushed him aside, that he was a man born into the wrong economy. His wife later recalled that he believed something evil was coming. The tragedy was that he was right. He just didn't understand the source of it. What made Huberty terrifying wasn't just the violence, it was the deliberateness. Hours before his rampage, he visited a mental health center seeking help, but left when the receptionist told him he wouldn't be seen that day. Later, he reportedly told his wife he was going hunting for humans. She didn't take it literally. She should have. Huberty entered a McDonald's in San Ysidro, California, with a calmness that unsettled witnesses long before they understood what was about to happen. For 77 minutes, he turned a family restaurant into a battlefield. People scrambled for cover behind counters and booths built for ketchup stains, not catastrophes. The nation watched in disbelief. This wasn't a remote wilderness or an underground hideout. This was a fast food chain where kids traded toys and adults debated milkshake flavors. Huberty cracked the illusion that public spaces were inherently safe. After San Ysidro, the country began looking at large glass windows, open seating plans, and crowded dining rooms with a new kind of caution. When the ordeal finally ended, investigators pieced together a portrait of a man undone by a mixture of grievance, isolation, and a worldview that had grown warped by resentment. Huberty wasn't driven by ideology. He wasn't plotting a message. He was a man who believed the world had ignored him until he forced it to pay attention. And as devastating as his story was, the next figure proves that terror doesn't always shout or storm in. Sometimes it ticks quietly under a city for years, waiting to be discovered. 10. George Metesky, Mad Bomber. In a city that prides itself on being unshakable, George Metesky found a way to make New York look over its shoulder. He didn't scream or draw attention to himself. He didn't march or monologue. Instead, he wrote polite letters, signed them as FP, short for fair play, and vanished into the crowd. For 16 years, Metesky planted bombs around New York City, in libraries, in theaters, at Grand Central Station. Some didn't go off. Some did. The damage was often small, but the psychological footprint was massive. He made the public feel like every corner had a secret, every briefcase might blink, not because of how much power he wielded, but because of how impossible he was to catch. The city started keeping track of where they found his devices. The map looked like a twisted transit guide, anywhere, anytime, always just out of reach. And that was the terror of it. Metesky didn't need mass destruction to hold a city hostage. He just needed a pattern and patience. The backstory wasn't what anyone expected. A former utility worker, Metesky had been injured on the job. When his disability claim was denied, he developed a grudge so intense it calcified into a worldview. His bombs, he said, were never meant to kill, just to make a point. as if terrorizing millions was just a form of civic commentary. He wore a suit when he planted devices. He carried himself like an office clerk. And he left notes with phrases like, "Justice will be served, and you have not heard the last of me." What chilled investigators wasn't rage, it was precision. Metesky was methodical, focused, almost coldly polite. His eventual arrest came not through brute force, but through forensic psychiatry. The NYPD published one of his letters, and a civilian reader helped identify him through tone and grammar. He lived in a quiet suburban home with his sisters. His neighbors were stunned. Because Metesky wasn't a monster in a cave, he was the guy raking leaves next door, and he made it clear that sometimes the scariest people aren't wild-eyed strangers. They're the ones who think they're just restoring balance. And when it comes to balance, no one thought more about morality until it collapsed than the man who inspired an entire generation of horror. 11. Ed Gein. Ed Gein never left Wisconsin, but somehow he got into all our heads. He lived on a farmhouse outside the small town of Plainfield, in a house that had been crumbling for years, surrounded by dust, decay, and unanswered questions. People knew he was odd, kept to himself, said strange things in a voice that always seemed one notch off. But Plainfield was the kind of town where odd meant you were just part of the landscape. Until police walked into his home. What they found didn't just shock Wisconsin. It fractured the country's sense of what ordinary could mean. And while the media tried to piece together a coherent narrative, what remained was confusion. How could a man this quiet harbor something this disturbing? There were no warning signs in the way the movies promised. No dramatic music. Just a man buying pork rinds and making casual conversation at the hardware store. Gein became the model for fictional characters who would later haunt pop culture. Norman Bates, Leatherface, Buffalo Bill. But the man himself was almost underwhelming in person. Soft-spoken, meek, more like a shadow than a presence. And that contradiction is part of what terrified the nation. He didn't look like someone to fear. He looked like a man who'd help you change a tire and then disappear into the fog. What made Ed Gein endure as a cultural symbol wasn't just the crime. It was the way it shattered the fragile wall between rural innocence and moral collapse. He didn't live in a big city, wasn't radicalized by television or politics. He was just there. And what happened in his mind stayed hidden for years, undetected, until it leaked out into the real world. He made people rethink their assumptions. About loners, about small towns, about the safety of simplicity. If anything, Gein wasn't just a terrifying figure. He was a rupture. A before and after moment in America's relationship with the concept of harmless. And while Gein acted alone, the next man made sure he'd never have to be alone again. Because when terror becomes a shared belief system, you don't need one man. You need a family. 12. Albert Fish. Albert Fish was what happened when childhood trauma grew legs and walked into polite society with a grin. In the 1920s and 30s, he was known by many names. The Gray Man, the Brooklyn Vampire, and, most chillingly, the Boogeyman. But all of them fell short of capturing what made him so unsettling. Because Fish wasn't just feared for what he did. He was feared for how little he seemed to mind doing it. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1870, Fish's early life reads like a long string of red flags left entirely unattended. But rather than spiral visibly, he blended in. He was soft-spoken, courteous, and had an almost grandfatherly demeanor that made it easier for people to explain away their suspicions. That was his talent. He weaponized normalcy. Newspapers at the time barely had the language to describe him. Editors argued over how much to print. Reporters sidestepped details. Even hardened police officers described his behavior in terms that suggested confusion rather than comprehension. It was as if the human brain struggled to process the gap between his outward persona and his inner life. Fish corresponded with investigators and victims' families, leaving behind writings that didn't offer answers, only deeper questions. Not rants, not manifestos, but statements that sounded like he was dictating from another planet, one where empathy had been drained out and replaced with something unrecognizable. In court, Fish's calm demeanor unnerved everyone. He wasn't angry, he wasn't regretful. He just existed, like a fog that had taken human shape. The jury struggled to agree on whether he was sane, not because they thought he was normal, but because nothing in the legal code seemed prepared to define someone like him. Albert Fish is terrifying not because of magnitude, but because of magnitude wrapped in gentleness. A man who seemed like a children's book character at a glance, and yet left entire cities shaken. And as monstrous as he was, the next name on the list asked an even more terrifying question. What if evil isn't hidden in shadows at all? What if it sings? 13. Charles Manson. Charles Manson never needed to lift a weapon to terrify America. He weaponized people instead. He drifted into the late 1960s like a stray spark looking for a pile of dry grass. California had become the land of spiritual seekers, runaway teenagers, disillusioned veterans, and anyone who believed a change in scenery could fix the holes in their life. Manson, with his soft voice, piercing stare, and endless supply of half-baked mystical philosophies, stepped into that landscape like he'd been summoned. What made Manson terrifying wasn't his appearance. He was small, wiry, almost fragile-looking. Not the silhouette of a nightmare, more like the shape of a man who should have been asking for gas money at a rest stop. But he had something far more dangerous than size. He understood lonely people. He understood what they wanted to hear. And he understood how to turn insecurity into devotion. The family he gathered around him didn't start as a cult. It started as a commune. Free love, free food, free music, free thinking. Manson fed his followers a rotating diet of borrowed philosophies. Eastern wisdom mixed with pseudo-psychology, sprinkled with apocalyptic visions and rock and roll metaphysics. He framed himself as a guide, a protector, a prophet. And somehow it worked. Hollywood, meanwhile, wasn't as far away as it looked. Manson hovered around the music industry, believing he was destined for fame. When those ambitions soured, when the industry rejected him, something inside him hardened. His teachings shifted from spiritual liberation to doomsday warnings and coded prophecies. He started framing the world as a battlefield only he understood. The true horror of Manson wasn't the crimes themselves, though they shook the nation. It was the realization that he didn't commit them. He simply convinced others to do so. His power came from persuasion, not force. From charisma, not muscle. From the willingness of fragile minds to let him rewrite their morality. In court, he carved an X into his forehead, ranted about cosmic forces, and treated the proceedings like performance art. His followers echoed him, eyes glazed, voices steady, as if wired into his consciousness. Manson became a symbol of something America didn't want to admit. That vulnerability can be exploited, that charisma can corrupt, and that a quiet man with a guitar and a philosophy can bend reality for people desperate enough to believe him. But if Manson manipulated a handful of followers, the next figure manipulated an entire community and convinced hundreds to place their trust in him all the way to the end. 14. Jim Jones. Jim Jones didn't start as a villain. He started as a hero. Or at least that's what people thought. Before the world knew his name for tragedy, he was a rising figure in civil rights activism, a charismatic preacher blending social justice with spiritual fervor. People who met him early on described him as compassionate, passionate, and tirelessly devoted to helping the poor, which made his evolution all the more terrifying. Jones understood the power of belonging. He built the People's Temple as a sanctuary for the disillusioned, The elderly, the downtrodden, young activists, working-class families searching for stability. His sermons mixed biblical themes with political rhetoric, creating a hybrid ideology that felt revolutionary. And for many, he was the first leader who truly made them feel seen. But as his influence grew, so did his paranoia. He began weaving stories of conspiracies, enemies, government plots. He claimed the world was full of unseen dangers, and that only he could protect his followers from them. Slowly, the People's Temple stopped being a movement and started becoming a shield. Jones moved the community to Guyana, framing it as a utopia free from American corruption. What the world didn't realize at the time was that this move didn't represent hope. It represented isolation, the oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook. Jonestown wasn't the paradise he promised. It was a pressure cooker. Long sermons, confiscated passports, strict discipline, increasingly delusional speeches broadcast over loudspeakers. Jones grew erratic, then obsessive, then unrecognizable. The man once known for empathy now saw betrayal in every shadow. The tragedy that unfolded shocked the world, but the buildup had been visible for years. A community ruled by fear, obedience, and the slow erosion of critical thought. Investigators and defectors tried sounding the alarm, but Jones always stayed one step ahead, shaping the narrative with the skill of a seasoned illusionist. The horror of Jim Jones lies not only in the final outcome, but in how long people believed him, how deeply they trusted him, how fully he convinced them that loyalty should eclipse logic. He proved that a leader doesn't have to shout to be dangerous. Sometimes he just has to whisper exactly what people want to hear. And if Jones perfected emotional control, the next man built his entire identity on spiritual domination and a belief that the end of the world had already begun. 15. David Koresh. David Koresh didn't walk into Waco claiming to be a leader. He walked in claiming to be a student. A young man fascinated by biblical prophecy and the idea that hidden meanings were scattered like seeds through Scripture. But fascination, for Koresh, eventually became obsession. Obsession became identity, and identity became authority. By the time he took control of the Branch Davidians, Koresh had already reinvented himself. He changed his name, changed his role, changed his story so often that followers stopped questioning which version was real. That was how he worked, by making the uncertain feel certain. He had a talent for delivering long, winding sermons that felt like riddles unraveling. Mystical, confusing, but somehow convincing. Where others saw contradictions, his followers saw depth. Where others saw self-importance, they saw divine selection. Koresh understood that once you convince someone the world is ending, you become the architect of their survival. At Mount Carmel, the Davidians' compound outside Waco, Koresh created a micro-society built around his interpretations of Scripture. He preached about seals, revelations, battles between cosmic forces. He spoke with a calm, deliberate cadence that made even the most alarming statements sound like eternal truths. Over time, outside observers grew increasingly concerned. Reports trickled in about strict control over daily life, about unusual doctrines, about Koresh's belief that he was receiving messages directly from God. The structure of the compound, the stockpiling of supplies, the escalating rhetoric, it all formed a picture of a man preparing for conflict. When federal agents began investigating the Davidians, Koresh leaned into the narrative he had been building for years. The world outside was hostile, dangerous, and incapable of understanding God's plan. Any conflict with authorities would prove he'd been right all along. The standoff that followed wasn't just a clash between government and sect. It was a collision of worldviews, one rooted in law, the other rooted in prophecy. Koresh's followers stayed with him not because they were trapped physically, but because they were trapped ideologically. He had rewritten their understanding of danger, loyalty, and salvation. The end shocked the nation. It forced America to question how belief, paranoia, and authority can merge into something combustible. And as the smoke cleared, the country braced itself for a new kind of terror, one that didn't come from prophecy, but from the night itself. 16. Richard Ramirez. When Richard Ramirez stepped into the national spotlight, he didn't creep in quietly. He burst through the front door, figuratively and literally, and left California in a collective state of insomnia. In the summer of 1985, Los Angeles didn't sleep much, not because of earthquakes or wildfires, but because of one man known only at the time by two chilling words: the Night Stalker. Ramirez didn't care about patterns. That's what made him dangerous. Most law enforcement playbooks are built on the assumption that criminals crave consistency. Ramirez tore up that rule. He struck in wealthy suburbs and working-class neighborhoods, at midnight or just before dawn, alone or with a getaway plan so flimsy it might as well have been a shrug. Victims were different ages, backgrounds, and circumstances. The only consistency was randomness, and the sheer psychological impact that came with it. He had a flair for the dramatic. He left behind cryptic messages. He seemed to relish the idea that the media was trying to track him, as if the whole city were playing a game of hide and seek, except only one person knew the rules, and the prize was terror. His signature wasn't just in what he did. It was in how he made people feel, unsafe, watched, and unsure if the lock on their door was enough. As the investigation unfolded, police officers began sleeping in shifts, and citizens began carrying weapons. Parents checked closets before tucking in their kids. The sun rising over the Pacific didn't bring peace. It brought dread about what had happened during the hours when no one felt safe. What made Ramirez even more unsettling was the way he reacted once he was caught. In court, he smirked. He posed. He turned the trial into a twisted stage. He didn't deny his role. He seemed to enjoy it, and the public in turn couldn't look away. It wasn't just the crimes. It was the spectacle of a man who embraced fear like it was a career. But if Ramirez personified chaos in one city, the next man on the list took chaos nationwide, for years, while blending into the wallpaper of suburban life. 17. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Gary Ridgway was not the kind of man you noticed, and that's exactly why he was so dangerous. In the Seattle suburbs, Ridgway looked like any other middle-aged guy trying to make it through the work week. He held a steady job painting trucks. He was mild-mannered, punctual, polite. He wore jeans that always seemed slightly too short and had the posture of someone who never quite got comfortable with his own name. There was nothing about him that shouted threat, nothing that even whispered it. And yet for decades he haunted the Pacific Northwest. Not with theatrics or grandiose declarations, but with quiet consistency. Police gave him a name, the Green River Killer, before they ever found his face. His victims were discovered near water in wooded areas, or not discovered at all. The investigation stretched on, frustrating detectives with their dead ends and red herrings. Task forces formed, dissolved, reformed, leads dried up. The fear stayed. What made Ridgway so chilling wasn't just the scale of his actions, though that was horrifying enough. It was how absolutely invisible he made himself. He passed lie detector tests. He offered to help investigators. He even worked at the same factory for 30 years, which is more stability than most people achieve. In the end, it took forensic technology catching up to him. DNA told the truth when everything else failed. When Ridgway was arrested, colleagues were stunned. His neighbors were speechless. He had barbecues. He waved at people walking their dogs. He paid his bills. But under the surface, he had created a second life that no one suspected. And during his confession? No remorse. No reflection. Just a man calmly listing facts, as if recounting a long-forgotten to-do list. His voice was even, almost tired, like someone trying to get through paperwork so he could go home. The true fear Ridgway left behind wasn't just in what he did. It was the realization that someone could live in plain sight for so long and almost get away with it. And if Ridgway proved that evil could be methodical, the next man made it terrifyingly improvisational, building a toolkit for death and tucking it away town by town. 18. Israel Keyes. Israel Keyes didn't look terrifying. He didn't sound terrifying. And for most of his life, he didn't seem like a man who would one day cause FBI agents to sit in silence, listening to a confession that felt more like a lesson in how to disappear. Keyes wasn't famous in life, not until the end. That's part of what makes him such a haunting figure. He didn't want recognition. He wanted control. Unlike the others on this list, Keyes didn't leave behind messages, crave attention, or bask in notoriety. He operated in reverse. The less people knew about him, the more satisfied he seemed to be. His technique? Chillingly organized. He traveled across states without drawing attention. He paid in cash. He avoided patterns. And most disturbingly, he created what the FBI would later call kill kits. Boxes of tools buried near various locations around the country. Shovels, restraints, weapons, maps, all waiting. Sometimes for years. His idea of preparedness wasn't paranoid. It was surgical. When he was finally caught, it wasn't due to surveillance or tracking software. It was a slip, a small mistake, a purchase with a traceable card. But even in custody, Keyes held the power. He teased out information. He confessed only in fragments. He made investigators work for every detail, every clue, every hint at just how far his reach had extended. What rattled law enforcement wasn't just the content of his crimes. It was the structure, the planning, the fact that he built an entire system of anonymity and nearly perfected it. And then, just as suddenly, he was gone. Keyes is terrifying because he wasn't driven by rage or impulse or ideology. He was driven by logistics, cold, calculated planning, like someone mapping a road trip with no intention of coming back. And while many think of serial crime as chaotic, Keyes left a different kind of message. What if the real horror isn't disorder? What if it's precision? 19. H. Holmes. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known by his chosen name, Dr. H. Holmes, was less a man and more a walking contradiction, a mix of charm, intelligence, and bone-deep deceit. He was America's first media-made boogeyman, emerging from the smoke and gears of the Gilded Age, right when cities were growing faster than morals could catch up. Holmes was a con man at heart, a fraudster, a liar, a professional confidence artist in a time when credentials were easy to forge and background checks didn't exist. He had the look of a gentleman and the soul of a tax form. Cold, calculating, transactional. What made him terrifying wasn't just what he was suspected of doing. It was how quickly he adapted to the new American landscape, turning ambition into a kind of weapon. Chicago's 1893 World's Fair was meant to showcase progress. But just a few miles away, Holmes was showcasing something else entirely. He built what would later be dubbed the Murder Castle, a grotesque nickname that newspapers couldn't resist. A hotel-like structure full of trapdoors, hidden corridors, soundproof rooms, and architectural oddities that made it less a place to stay and more a place to vanish. But even before the myth ballooned, Holmes was feared by the people who knew him best. Business partners, creditors, former associates who discovered too late that he didn't just lie, he erased. Every partnership ended in a financial dispute or a missing person. His confidence schemes were layered, complex, and ruthless. He forged documents, married under aliases, and treated trust as something to be pocketed and spent. When he was finally caught, it was for fraud. The more horrific possibilities emerged later, piece by piece, in testimony and speculation. He confessed, recanted, then confessed again, seemingly enjoying the attention. His story blurred quickly into folklore, where fact and fiction traded places with abandon. The real horror of Holmes wasn't just what he might have done, it was how easy it was for him to do it. In a rapidly growing city, in a time of progress, no one asked too many questions. And that silence is exactly what made room for the next figure. Someone with no mansion, no myth, but a kind of fury that could never stay quiet for long. 20. Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos didn't blend in. She didn't try to. From the moment she entered the public eye, she clashed with expectations, with social norms, with the roles women were supposed to play in both life and infamy. She didn't wear the mask, she tore it off, loudly, violently, and unapologetically. Wuornos's story is complicated, often retold through headlines that focused more on sensationalism than substance. She became a symbol of fear, of trauma, of society's failure to know what to do with women who didn't behave. What terrified people about her wasn't just her actions. It was the rawness of her rage. She wasn't calculating. She wasn't coy. She didn't try to charm the jury or soften the narrative. She stared straight at the camera and told the world what she thought. Raised in instability, thrown from place to place, Wuornos grew up in the margins. She lived a life of survival. Not quietly, but in a way that broadcast every wound. Her adult life followed suit, drifting, hustling, getting by however she could. But when her crimes came to light, the country wasn't sure how to process her. She didn't fit the mold of the quiet, methodical figure that had become familiar. She was loud, emotional, furious, and, at times, oddly lucid. Psychologists debated over her motives. Journalists portrayed her as either a monster or a martyr. The truth, as always, was more complicated. A portrait of someone who had been burning for a long time and eventually exploded in ways no one could ignore. In interviews, Wuornos's tone swung from defensiveness to defiance, sometimes in the same sentence. She was both deeply human and deeply unpredictable, which made her story harder to dismiss. You couldn't put her in a clean category. She wouldn't stay there. Wuornos unsettled people because she shattered the expected shape of fear. She wasn't in hiding. She wasn't pretending. She walked straight through the spotlight with everything exposed. And if her anger left people shaken, the next figure returned us to a different kind of dread. One hidden behind sterile white coats and silver instruments. Because not all horror screams. Some of it comes dressed as help. 21. Dr. Walter Freeman. Dr. Walter Freeman called himself a pioneer. History calls him something else entirely. In mid-20th century America, Freeman was a respected neurologist. Articulate, persuasive, the kind of man who could sell radical ideas with a smile and a slide projector. And the idea he sold was this: mental illness, no matter how complex, could be treated with a simple, outpatient procedure. No need for psychiatric wards, no long-term hospitalization. Just a few minutes, a sharp tool, and a steady hand. The procedure was the lobotomy. Freeman didn't invent it, but he certainly branded it. He called it a miracle cure, a one-size-fits-all solution to everything from depression to anxiety to childhood behavior. In a time when mental health treatment was desperate and limited, desperate families lined up to believe him. He performed thousands of lobotomies across the country, often in front of crowds, sometimes in portable vans he nicknamed his lobotomobile. With an ice pick and a hammer, he would demonstrate his technique as if he were a magician revealing a new trick. He claimed patients were calmer, more manageable, relieved. But what many really became was subdued, slowed, diminished. Even some hospitals grew uneasy. The procedure was crude, the results unpredictable, and Freeman was known for bypassing formal psychiatric evaluations. If a family said someone was acting strange, he was ready to intervene, quickly, permanently. What's terrifying about Freeman isn't just the procedure. It's how close he got to being celebrated for it. He published in medical journals. He appeared in newsreels. For a time, he was considered a visionary. It took years, and ruined lives, for the tide to turn. Eventually, the backlash came. Colleagues turned on him. Lawsuits mounted. The medical establishment distanced itself. But Freeman never really stopped believing in his own myth. Until the end, he claimed he had helped more than he had harmed. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He stood on stage, and in the silence of hospital corridors, he left behind a chilling legacy. The idea that sometimes the most terrifying people are the ones who think they're saving you. 22. Dr. John C. Cutler. Dr. John C. Cutler never carried a weapon, never raised his voice, and never broke the law. Instead, he worked in crisp suits and clean labs, surrounded by clipboards, government funding, and the cool reassurance of scientific authority. He was the kind of man whose name appeared in academic journals, whose research received federal approval, and whose actions were buried under layers of polite bureaucracy. And yet, his legacy is one of the most disturbing in American medical history. In the 1940s and 50s, Cutler was part of a series of U.S.-funded experiments aimed at studying sexually transmitted infections. At first glance, it seemed like standard medical research, cold, technical, distant. But behind the scientific language was something far darker. In Guatemala, with no consent from participants, vulnerable individuals were deliberately exposed to infections in the name of data. Prisoners, orphans, psychiatric patients, people with little ability to refuse or understand what was happening, were turned into unwitting test subjects. The rationale? That these studies would lead to better treatments. That scientific progress required sacrifice. That ethics were flexible in the pursuit of knowledge. Cutler wasn't rogue. He was endorsed. His work was funded, reviewed, and quietly accepted. That's what makes his story uniquely unsettling. He didn't operate in the shadows. He worked in the open, under the protective umbrella of institutional trust. And for decades, no one stopped him. The experiments were hidden for years, buried in archives and footnotes. When they finally came to light in the 21st century, the reaction was shock, then shame. The U.S. government issued an official apology. Historians reevaluated how often medical ethics had really just meant whatever we can get away with. Cutler himself never expressed clear regret. He defended his work until the end, couching it in the language of necessity and national interest. For him, it was research. For the rest of the world, it was a chilling example of how science, stripped of empathy, becomes something else entirely. And if Cutler's cold detachment felt inhuman, the next figure took medical confidence one step further, removing not just choice but body parts, in pursuit of an unproven cure. 23. Dr. Henry Cotton. Dr. Henry Cotton believed he was saving lives. That's what makes his story so haunting. In the early 20th century, Cotton was the medical director at the Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey, one of the most prominent psychiatric institutions of its time. He was articulate, confident, and driven by a single obsessive theory: that mental illness was caused by hidden infections in the body. Remove the infection, he claimed, and the mind would heal. The logic seemed seductive, and Cotton had no shortage of support. Backed by colleagues and hailed by the press, he introduced a wave of aggressive treatments: teeth, tonsils, stomachs, spleens. Anything that could harbor bacteria was a potential culprit. If a patient didn't improve after one operation, Cotton simply moved on to the next organ. Success rates were inflated. Failures were dismissed. And in the echo chamber of early psychiatry, Cotton became a star. But behind the medical language was a mounting pile of human cost. Patients were operated on without clear consent, without proper hygiene standards, and without second opinions. Some recovered, sure, but many didn't. And those who did survive often lived with lifelong trauma and physical damage. The tragedy of Cotton isn't just that he was wrong. It's how confidently he was wrong. He sincerely believed he was helping, and that made him harder to challenge. Critics were brushed off as unscientific. Dissenters were accused of slowing progress, and by the time investigations finally began questioning his practices, the damage had already been done. Even after scrutiny increased, Cotton's defenders insisted his heart had been in the right place. But that's the problem, isn't it? A doctor with good intentions, unchecked power, and a flawed theory can do more harm than a criminal ever could. Cotton's legacy forced the medical community to ask uncomfortable questions about ego, authority, and the thin line between innovation and delusion. And if Cotton carved through the body in search of invisible infections, the next figure carved through history, spreading poison dressed up as progress, until the world finally called it what it was. 24. Dr. Thomas Neal Cream. If you're looking for a man who weaponized respectability, look no further than Dr. Thomas Neal Cream. Born in Scotland, raised in Canada, and educated in the finest medical schools of the 19th century, Cream had all the credentials of a trusted physician. He carried himself with a professional polish, wore fashionable suits, and treated patients with the kind of attentive charm that makes you want to believe every word he says. But behind the white coat was a man who turned medicine into a mask. He wasn't interested in healing. He was interested in control, power, the performance of empathy without any of the substance. Cream traveled widely, Chicago, London, New York, setting up clinics and dispensing treatments that, more often than not, came with consequences. People got sicker. People died. But Cream was always one step ahead, shifting locations, changing his story, manipulating his credentials just enough to avoid suspicion. When concerns did arise, he deflected with ease. He blamed poor hygiene. He blamed other doctors. He even, at one point, tried to pin his actions on unknown chemicals. The truth was simpler. He had found a system that rewarded charm and punished scrutiny. And he used it. Authorities eventually caught up with him in London, where a series of suspicious deaths began pointing in one direction, toward a man with too many coincidences trailing behind him. His downfall came not because of a dramatic error, but because even the best lies have an expiration date. During his final days, Cream reportedly hinted at other crimes, suggesting a wider reach than anyone had imagined. Whether those claims were true or just ego on display remains a mystery. What makes Cream terrifying isn't just the harm he caused, it's how long he got away with it. How far intelligence and confidence can go when wrapped in the appearance of legitimacy. He reminds us that sometimes danger doesn't arrive with a mask or a weapon. Sometimes it arrives with a stethoscope, a diploma, and a handshake. And as Cream faded into history, the next figure sharpened a far stranger idea, one where food became the medicine and medicine became a reason not to eat at all. 25. Dr. Linda Burfield Hazard. Dr. Linda Burfield. Hazard believed that food was the enemy. Not bad food, not spoiled food, just food, period. She didn't sell pills, prescribe drugs, or recommend surgery. Instead, she promoted what she called therapeutic fasting, a cure-all approach that promised to cleanse the body, restore balance, and, conveniently, cost a small fortune. In early 20th century Washington state, Hazard opened what she called a sanitarium. Tucked into the woods, it was a quiet, almost serene facility that looked more like a spa than a clinic. Patients came from across the country, some from across the world, drawn in by her confident tone, her authoritative books, and the dream of healing what modern medicine couldn't. The treatment was always the same: fast, detox, repeat. No matter the illness, the prescription was starvation. Hazard claimed the body could heal itself if given a proper rest. But rest, in this context, meant prolonged fasting. For weeks, sometimes months. What made her terrifying wasn't just the extremity of her methods, it was her complete and unwavering certainty. When patients became frail, delirious, or unresponsive, she insisted it was part of the healing process. Skeptical families were dismissed. Questions were met with scorn. And when patients died, she often declared they had simply come to her too late. There were also reports, murky and never fully confirmed, of strange legal maneuverings. Patients who had signed over their possessions, changes to wills, documents signed when people were barely conscious. Hazard wasn't just a healer in her own mind. She was also, apparently, an opportunist. Eventually, authorities stepped in. A high-profile case involving two British sisters, one of whom died under Hazard's care, drew international attention. Investigations revealed enough to warrant her conviction. But even after serving time, Hazard returned to her practices, still convinced she was right. She died in 1938, reportedly undergoing her own fasting treatment at the time. Dr. Hazard's legacy is a cautionary tale about belief unchecked by evidence, about what happens when ideology hardens into dogma. And if she starved the body in the name of healing, the next figure took a far more intrusive approach, one that would leave the medical world reeling for decades. 26. Dr. James Burt. Dr. James Burt wasn't a household name. He wasn't featured in documentaries or splashed across headlines. He was, for most of his career, just another doctor in Ohio. Mild-mannered, confident, and quietly respected. Patients trusted him. Hospitals employed him. And that was the problem. In the 1960s and 70s, Burt developed a theory, a deeply flawed one. He believed that many of his female patients, even those not seeking treatment for anything serious, required what he called enhancement, a vague, unscientific term he used to justify procedures they hadn't asked for and didn't consent to. He wrote a book about his philosophy, full of medical jargon and a tone that swung between paternalistic and disturbingly self-assured. He claimed he was improving people's lives, making them better, more functional, more satisfied. But the reality, as it eventually came to light, was something else entirely. A trail of women whose trust had been violated under the guise of care. What made Burt so chilling was how long it took to stop him. For years, complaints were ignored, dismissed, or settled quietly. The medical establishment, perhaps out of disbelief, perhaps out of embarrassment, hesitated to intervene. He worked for decades without serious oversight. That's the part that sticks. He didn't operate in the shadows. He operated in hospitals, under fluorescent lights, surrounded by systems that should have protected people. Eventually, whistleblowers pushed harder. Former patients came forward. Lawsuits mounted. His medical license was revoked in 1989. By then, the damage had been done. And Burt, even in disgrace, maintained that he had only ever tried to help. There was no remorse, only rationalization. Burt's case became a turning point in discussions about consent, patient rights, and institutional accountability. It forced the medical community to ask why it had taken so long, and how many others might have slipped through the cracks with similar authority. And as hospitals reeled from the reckoning, the next figure on our list was already crafting a new kind of mask, one that looked friendly, professional, and utterly harmless, until it wasn't. 27. Dr. Richard Sharp. Dr. Richard Sharp was a textbook example of how society mistakes credentials for character. He was a Harvard-educated physician, a specialist in dermatology, a man who wore white coats, attended medical conferences, and held respected positions. By every external measure, he was the kind of person you'd trust with your life. And many did, until they found out what was behind the polished surface. In public, Sharp projected the image of a man in control. But privately, his life was unraveling. He struggled with personal issues that spiraled into darker territory, emotional instability, erratic behavior, and a growing sense of grievance that seemed to coil tighter with each passing year. His colleagues began to notice. But in the medical world, strange behavior can sometimes be dismissed as eccentricity, especially when it comes packaged in a prestigious resume. What makes Sharp terrifying isn't just what he did. It's how he weaponized his status to deflect suspicion. When complaints surfaced, they were met with excuses. When his judgment was questioned, he pushed back with authority. And as his personal life became more volatile, the danger around him increased. But slowly, quietly, like a fuse burning inside a locked drawer. His story came to a head in the early 2000s, not with an outburst, but with a controlled act of calculated finality. In the aftermath, investigators and reporters alike were left sifting through a profile that made less sense the more they examined it. This wasn't a man with a long history of violence or a known criminal past. He was respected, decorated, trusted, and yet no one saw it coming. The legacy of Dr. Richard Sharp isn't just a singular tragedy. It's a reminder of how trust can be misplaced, how a person can hide dysfunction behind degrees, how systems often hesitate to question their own when the facade looks intact. If Sharp represented the collapse of personal ethics under pressure, the next figure on our list showed us something even more disturbing. A doctor who brought destruction not through one act, but through years of silent, systematic harm, one patient at a time. 28. Dr. Carl Muller. Dr. Carl Muller isn't a household name, and perhaps that's part of what makes his story so chilling. His work never sparked nationwide headlines. No high-profile trials. No books written about his fall from grace. Instead, his legacy survives in a quiet kind of unease. The discomfort that comes from realizing just how easy it is for a doctor to do damage under the guise of care. Muller was an Americanized immigrant physician, trained abroad and eventually licensed in the U.S., who developed a fascination with cutting-edge cancer therapies, particularly radiation. The mid-20th century was an era of rapid medical advancement, and radiation, new, powerful, and barely understood, was the miracle weapon of the day. But for Muller, it became more than a treatment. It became an obsession. He administered aggressive, unproven radiation regimens to patients who came to him with hope. Many didn't know the risks. Many weren't told the full details. And some, it seems, were treated without any clear diagnosis at all. What they trusted as healing turned into unexplained symptoms, deteriorating health, and long-term consequences they were never prepared for. Muller saw himself as a pioneer. That's the terrifying part. He wasn't intentionally cruel, at least not in the traditional sense. He truly believed in what he was doing, believed that he was pushing medicine forward, breaking through red tape, accelerating progress. And when early signs suggested things were going wrong, he didn't slow down. He doubled down. Records suggest that complaints were filed, that warnings were raised. But bureaucracy is slow, and confidence is persuasive, especially when cloaked in the language of scientific advancement. By the time his methods drew serious scrutiny, the damage had long been done, patients harmed, data skewed, lives altered forever. Dr. Muller's story is a warning about the gray zone where ambition becomes recklessness, where medical experimentation loses its compass, and where the white coat becomes a kind of armor, shielding doctors not just from doubt, but from accountability. And if Muller's mistakes were wrapped in silence, the next figure would go on to become the most prolific killer in the American medical system, while barely anyone noticed for years. 29. Dr. Charles Cullen. Dr. Charles Cullen was the last person you'd expect to fear in a hospital. He was quiet, awkward, often described as helpful by coworkers, and largely invisible to most patients. He worked night shifts, the lonely hours when hospitals go dim and time seems to stretch. And that's when his second life began. Over a 16-year career, Cullen worked at more than 9 hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Each time he left one under a cloud of suspicion, another hired him with minimal background checks. His resume looked clean. His references weren't questioned too closely. And every time, he got access to the one thing he needed: vulnerable patients and medication. Cullen didn't rage. He didn't explode. He didn't fit any of the tropes. Instead, he quietly manipulated hospital systems, exploiting weaknesses in drug protocols, bypassing safeguards, using technical knowledge to do things no one was watching for. When patients declined suddenly and inexplicably, it was often written off as bad luck. Hospitals hesitated to dig deeper, worried about liability. And so Cullen kept moving. It wasn't until years later, after dozens, possibly hundreds, of deaths, that someone finally asked the right questions. A few determined colleagues noticed patterns. An internal investigation caught anomalies in medication logs. And slowly, the puzzle began to take shape. When confronted, Cullen confessed. But even his confession was blurry. He spoke of mercy, of relieving suffering. But investigators saw something else: a man who had grown comfortable with power, who had found a loophole in the system and crawled through it for years without consequence. Dr. Charles Cullen is believed to be the most prolific serial killer in American history. And the worst part? He wasn't a genius. He wasn't supernatural. He simply existed in a system that didn't want to believe someone like him could exist. A man with access, with knowledge, with keys to the cabinet. He turned healthcare into harm, one silent moment at a time. And as we leave the halls of medicine behind, we now step into a different kind of battlefield, one where belief becomes violence and ideology bleeds into action. 30. Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald was a man who believed the world owed him something: attention, recognition, purpose. And when the world didn't deliver, he carved his own legacy out of confusion and smoke. Oswald's life reads like a passport stamped with discontent. Born in New Orleans, raised in a series of unstable homes, he drifted from city to city, ideology to ideology, never fully fitting in, but always insisting he understood something others didn't. He enlisted in the Marines, defected to the Soviet Union, returned to the U.S., disillusioned with both. A man in ideological freefall, convinced that history had a space waiting just for him. He was obsessed with political identity, yet his beliefs shifted constantly. Communist sympathizer, disappointed capitalist, revolutionary without a cause. He was all of these depending on the week. That inconsistency made him unreadable, and unreadable people scare us, because we don't know what they're capable of. Then came November 22nd, 1963. In the span of a few seconds in Dallas, Texas, Oswald altered the course of American history. With one act, he shattered the illusion that presidents were untouchable. The country froze, stunned, not just by what had happened, but by who had done it. Oswald didn't look like a villain. He looked like a math teacher, or the guy who shelves books at the library. That ordinariness made everything worse. When he was arrested, Oswald denied everything, smirking, cryptic, saying he was a patsy. And just like that, a conspiracy industrial complex was born. Theories spiraled, motives were questioned, connections were fabricated, then investigated, then denied. Oswald became less a person and more a symbol of distrust, of paranoia, of how fragile American confidence really was. And before he could answer any questions, he was silenced. Shot on live television by Jack Ruby, another man with his own delusions of destiny. The terror of Oswald isn't just in what he did. It's that he was no one, and he changed everything. And if Oswald shook the nation with a rifle and a camera flash, the next man would tear through history's curtain with a pistol and a monologue and write his name into the nation's wound. 31. John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was already a star before he became a villain. A famous actor, known across the country for his dramatic roles and magnetic stage presence. He had charm, he had talent. And he had a deep, burning conviction that history would only remember the bold. But his idea of bold wasn't applause. It was assassination. Booth lived in a divided America, one still scarred by war. While the North celebrated victory, Booth brooded. He saw Abraham Lincoln not as a savior, but as a tyrant, a destroyer of Southern values, a man whose leadership, in Booth's eyes, had twisted the Constitution into something unrecognizable. These beliefs weren't fringe in his circles. They were fuel. Booth didn't snap. He built his decision brick by brick. April 14, 1865. Ford's Theater. Booth knew the building well, knew the stage, knew the timing. When he stepped into Lincoln's box, he wasn't panicking. He wasn't rushing. He was performing. One final act, not for an audience, but for the future. He saw himself as a patriot, not a murderer. And after the shot rang out, he leapt to the stage and shouted a line from Latin theater, "Sic semper tyrannis." Thus always to tyrants. It should have been the end. Instead, it was just the beginning of the chase. For 12 days, Booth fled, across swamps, through farms, aided by sympathizers, chased by soldiers. America was no longer a grieving nation. It was a hunting nation. When they finally found him, he refused to surrender. The barn went up in flames, and Booth met the end he had always written for himself. Defiant, dramatic, and full of delusion. The horror of Booth is rooted in something deeper than violence. It's the realization that charisma and conviction can be deadly when paired with theatrical self-importance. He didn't just want to kill a man. He wanted to rewrite the script of America. And if Booth used ideology as a stage, the next man weaponized belief through militia and myth, and aimed to bring down the system one explosive plan at a time. 32. Robert Matthews. The Order. Robert J. Matthews didn't believe in America, at least not the one flying flags over post offices and printing money at the Federal Reserve. The America he believed in was smaller, purer, and infinitely more dangerous. A white ethno-state born out of violence and fire. In the early 1980s, Matthews formed The Order, a paramilitary group that took its name from a white supremacist novel, The Turner Diaries, which imagined the overthrow of the U.S. government through race war. It wasn't just fiction to Matthews, it was instruction. He recruited believers, trained them, armed them, and laid out plans to fund a revolution through robbery, fraud, and targeted attacks. They weren't subtle. The Order stole millions through armored car heists. They assassinated a Jewish radio host. They spread their ideology through underground networks. To some, they were freedom fighters. To most, they were domestic terrorists. Shadows moving through forests, striking from behind flags twisted into new meanings. What made Matthews terrifying wasn't just what he did. It was how deeply he believed in it. He wasn't acting out of confusion or desperation. He had a vision, and he convinced others to follow it. He framed his violence as destiny, and that framing allowed him to justify anything. The FBI caught up with him in 1984. He barricaded himself inside a house on Whidbey Island, Washington. A standoff followed. Hours of negotiation, tension, threats. But Matthews never planned to walk out. As federal agents closed in, the house went up in flames. His voice, reportedly still shouting over the radio, was the last thing they heard. Matthews's death turned him into a martyr for fringe movements. His writings still circulate online. His actions still inspire hate groups. His name has become a rallying cry for those convinced that the end justifies the fire. He didn't just try to tear down the country. He tried to replace it with a myth, one built on fear, division, and control. And if Matthews burned with rage, the next figure fanned those flames. Not from the shadows, but from the pulpit. 33. Sam Bowers. Sam Bowers didn't hide in the forest. He didn't wear camouflage. He wore a suit, a tie, glasses. He spoke clearly with calm authority and always insisted he was just defending tradition. That's how white-collar terror works. It calls itself heritage and insists it's being misunderstood. As the imperial wizard of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, Bowers wasn't the face of a rogue gang. He was the architect of one of the most violent, tightly organized chapters of the Klan during the Civil Rights era. He believed in systems, not just to support his beliefs, but to enforce them. Bowers turned Mississippi into a stage for racial intimidation. Cross burnings, threats, and beatings were the opening act. What came next was far worse. In 1964, 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, went missing during Freedom Summer. Their disappearance sparked national outrage, and the FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history. For weeks, the search turned up nothing but silence and suspicion. Then the truth came out. The men had been murdered, their bodies hidden under an earthen dam. The plan wasn't chaotic. It was orchestrated, and Bowers, sitting at the top, had ordered it. What made Bowers terrifying was the combination of calm and cruelty. He didn't shout or boast. He framed himself as a patriot, a protector of Southern values, while orchestrating acts of terror meant to crush dissent and instill fear. His version of America was one where law and violence were interchangeable, and where morality was nothing more than a matter of race. Despite evidence linking him to multiple attacks, Bowers managed to evade justice for decades. Trials ended in hung juries. Witnesses were intimidated, and for years he remained in the shadows of polite society, not hiding, but simply being ignored. Eventually, justice caught up. In 1998, more than 30 years after the murders, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But the delay revealed something chilling. How long a system can protect a man, even when everyone already knows what he's done. And if Bowers sat at the head of a table of terror, the next figure kept trying to pull up a seat, again and again, until even his allies started to flinch. 34. Byron. De la Beckwith. Byron. De la Beckwith had one goal: to stop history in its tracks. And when peaceful protests, court rulings, and voting rights began reshaping the South in the 1960s, he didn't debate or write letters to the editor. He picked up a rifle. Beckwith was a member of the White Citizens Council, a group that dressed up bigotry in business suits and policy jargon. But beneath the surface, he carried the same hatred as the Klan, just with a more polished veneer. He claimed to love America, but only a version of it frozen in time, one where progress was a threat and equality was blasphemy. His target was Medgar Evers, a civil rights activist and World War II veteran who had become a leading voice for desegregation in Mississippi. Evers was smart, determined, and effective, which to Beckwith made him dangerous. On June 12, 1963, Evers was shot in his driveway, just steps from his front door. His family was inside. The bullet came from a distance, but the hatred behind it had been standing close for years. Authorities found the rifle almost immediately. Beckwith's fingerprints were on it. He bragged about the act to friends, and yet he wasn't convicted. Not once, but twice. All white juries failed to reach a verdict. Beckwith walked free, smiling, treating the trial as a minor inconvenience. For years he was a ghost, unrepentant, publicly defiant, and still attending rallies. He gave speeches. He ran for lieutenant governor. And every time he smiled for a photo, it felt like a warning. Justice could be delayed indefinitely if you shook the right hands. It wasn't until 1994, 31 years after the murder, that Beckwith was finally convicted in a third trial, this time with new evidence and a jury that didn't buy the myth. He was sentenced to life in prison, where he died less than a decade later. The fear Beckwith left behind wasn't just about what he did. It was about how long the system let him laugh about it. And if Beckwith represented violence wrapped in arrogance, the next figure would swap arrogance for ideology and build a following around a compound that stood like a fortress of fear. 35. Richard Butler. Richard Butler didn't storm cities. He built one, or at least a version of one. In the hills of northern Idaho, on a sprawling piece of land near the town of Hayden Lake, he founded the Aryan Nations Compound, a hybrid of cult, paramilitary base, and pseudo-religious retreat. There were guard towers, bunkers, armed patrols, sermons, symbols. For Butler, it wasn't just about hate. It was about building an alternate reality where hate was law. He wore the air of a pastor, spoke with the cadence of a preacher, and fused his white supremacist ideology with twisted interpretations of Christian theology. He believed that white Americans were God's chosen people, and that racial diversity was not just unwelcome. It was blasphemy. People came to him not just for ideas, but for a sense of belonging. Ex-soldiers, lost youth, anti-government radicals. At its height, Aryan Nations was more than just a group. It was a network. Butler hosted annual world congresses where extremists from across the country gathered to listen, strategize, and reaffirm their beliefs. But what terrified the surrounding communities was that Butler didn't consider himself fringe. He thought he was the future, and his compound was meant to be the first brick in a new white homeland. For years, local law enforcement tiptoed around the group. Neighbors lived in quiet fear. Even visitors knew to avoid the back roads near Hayden Lake. Acts of violence were often traced back to men who had passed through the compound, indoctrinated, armed, and sent back into the world. Eventually, the compound fell, not through dramatic raids, but through lawsuits. In 2000, a civil judgment bankrupted Aryan Nations after a security guard from the group assaulted a local woman and her son. The Southern Poverty Law Center helped bring the case, and the land was awarded to the victims. Butler faded, but the seeds he planted didn't. His blueprint for extremism, isolation, symbolism, spiritual justification, still echoes today in darker corners of the internet and militia movements. And as Butler's compound crumbled, another figure lurked in the woods, determined to remind the world that even a single man can hold an entire region in fear. 36. Eric Rudolph. Eric Rudolph was the kind of figure America thought it understood, until it didn't. At first, he was a blurry image on a surveillance camera, a name with a sketch, a headline that popped up again and again next to phrases like domestic terrorism, federal manhunt, and Olympic bombing. But the more investigators dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't a man acting on impulse. Rudolph had a plan. He also had patience. In 1996, the Summer Olympics were underway in Atlanta, a city buzzing with celebration and international attention. When a bomb went off in Centennial Olympic Park, the entire country flinched. One person was killed, over 100 were injured, and the sense of national pride was instantly replaced by unease. At first, another man, Richard Jewell, was falsely accused. But Rudolph's name emerged later, connected to a pattern that stretched far beyond one event. Between 1996 and 1998, Rudolph launched a string of bombings, targeting clinics, nightclubs, public spaces. He framed it all in ideological terms, issuing statements that read more like manifestos than explanations. He believed he was fighting for morality. But what he left behind was fear. Then he vanished. For 5 years, Eric Rudolph became a ghost. A manhunt stretched across the Southeast. Law enforcement poured millions into the search. The media painted him as a backwoods survivalist, possibly living in the mountains of North Carolina. And that's exactly where he was, hiding in the Nantahala National Forest, surviving off stashed supplies and small-town anonymity. His capture wasn't dramatic. A rookie police officer found him rummaging behind a grocery store dumpster. Just like that, the 5-year mystery ended, not with a standoff, but with a quiet arrest. Rudolph later pled guilty to avoid the death penalty, showing no regret, only repetition of his beliefs. The terrifying thing about Eric Rudolph isn't just what he did. It's how long he disappeared in plain sight. how ideology can masquerade as righteousness, and how a single man with enough conviction and time can turn public places into battlegrounds. And while Rudolph retreated into the wilderness, the next man broadcast his hatred from rooftops, wrapped in politics, wrapped in fire, and always aimed straight at the center of attention. 37. Tom Metzger. Tom Metzger never wore a mask. He didn't hide behind secret meetings or coded language. He spoke directly, clearly, and loudly, often into a microphone. He wasn't content with underground hate. He wanted it on cable television. A former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in California, Metzger later founded the White Aryan Resistance, GWAR, a group whose name removed any illusion of subtlety. While other extremists built compounds or stockpiled weapons, Metzger built a media strategy. He hosted a public access show, gave interviews, and actively worked to recruit through TV waves and newspaper quotes. His persona was polished, almost ordinary. He wore suits, spoke like a politician, and framed white supremacy as if it were just another point of view in the American marketplace of ideas. That was his trick, and his threat. He didn't snarl, he smiled, and he understood how to manipulate the First Amendment better than most of his critics. Metzger's influence was felt most sharply in 1988, when skinheads affiliated with his ideology brutally beat and murdered Mulugeta Serau, an Ethiopian student in Portland. The crime was horrifying, but what followed was equally shocking: a civil lawsuit against Metzger and his organization. Though he didn't commit the act himself, he had helped shape the beliefs of those who did. The court found him liable. The Southern Poverty Law Center took him to trial, and the verdict bankrupted WAR. Metzger lost his home, his platform, and most of his public power, but he never apologized. Instead, he doubled down, shifting to online platforms, adapting to new technologies, continuing to push his message long after the spotlight faded. Metzger was terrifying not because of what he did directly, but because of what he made others believe was acceptable. He understood that ideas don't need to be shouted from mountaintops when they can be softly planted in homes, living rooms, and voting booths. And while Metzger's war was cultural, the next man believed in something more literal and divine, building sermons out of fire and threats, and preaching a gospel no one wanted to hear echoing through the walls. 38. Steve Anderson. Steve Anderson didn't see himself as extreme. He saw himself as chosen. A self-described pastor and founder of Faithful Word Baptist Church in Arizona, Anderson wasn't interested in gentle interpretations or inclusive theology. His sermons weren't invitations. They were ultimatums. With a Bible in one hand and rage in the other, he delivered hours of vitriol packaged as scripture, targeting anyone who didn't match his narrow vision of moral correctness. But what makes Anderson terrifying isn't just his rhetoric. It's how normalized it can sound to the wrong ears. He preached in the cadence of old-school revivalists, quoting scripture like firewood, stacking it high until the blaze felt holy. His language often towed the line between free speech and incitement, and sometimes leapt over it entirely. He's gone viral more than once for sermons that crossed into open hostility, toward other faiths, toward marginalized groups, even toward national tragedies. He called for violence from the pulpit, wrapped in the language of divine justice. It was the kind of speech that made most people recoil. And yet, his congregation remained. Donations came in. Videos were shared. He became a symbol of a fringe movement that was less fringe than people wanted to believe. Anderson wasn't building compounds or stockpiling weapons. He was building doctrine. Digital archives, online influence. His sermons were clipped, uploaded, subtitled, translated, consumed by people looking for justification, not truth. That's what makes him dangerous. He didn't just preach hate. He turned it into a curriculum. Despite being banned from multiple countries for his views, Anderson insisted he was simply preaching the Bible. The legal system couldn't do much, protected as he was by free speech laws. And that protection, that thin legal insulation, allowed him to operate with impunity, knowing that outrage doesn't always lead to consequences. And as Anderson shouted from his pulpit, the next figure found a quieter path to fear, not through violence, but through whispers, rumors, and a list that could destroy your life before anyone checked the facts. 39. Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy didn't need weapons, followers, or a compound. All he needed was a list he never proved existed, a list he waved around like a talisman, a list that could ruin lives with a single name. In the early 1950s, America was already on edge. The Cold War had cast a long shadow, and the word communist had morphed into something less political and more existential. The idea that your neighbor, your teacher, or your favorite actor could be the enemy, smiling in your face and waiting for the signal to strike. Into that atmosphere walked Senator Joseph McCarthy, holding his unverified, shifting list of names and claiming the government was riddled with subversives. It was fear weaponized through bureaucracy. McCarthy didn't need to prove anything. He just needed to suggest, to accuse, to cast doubt. Careers were destroyed, reputations were shredded, and loyalty was measured by how loudly you condemned others. People testified against friends. Government workers were interrogated. Artists were blacklisted. Teachers disappeared from classrooms, all without charges, trials, or evidence that would hold up in any court, not fueled by paranoia. McCarthy's hearings became theater. He bullied witnesses, grandstanded for the cameras, and painted any hesitation as guilt. He didn't care if the facts were muddy. In fact, he preferred them that way. Confusion was his currency. What made McCarthy truly terrifying wasn't the scale of his power, but how easily he got it. A junior senator from Wisconsin, previously known for very little, he became one of the most feared men in the country almost overnight. Not because he exposed enemies, but because he created them. Eventually, the tide turned. The Army McCarthy hearings were broadcast live, and Americans saw the full spectacle, the bullying, the baseless claims, the unraveling of a man who had grown too comfortable in his own legend. He was censured by the Senate in 1954 and faded into political obscurity, but the damage lingered. McCarthy reminded the world that fear doesn't need proof, it just needs a microphone. And if paranoia was McCarthy's weapon of choice, the next figure chose something even more paradoxical: charm. A charm that masked the kind of betrayal no one saw coming. 40. O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson was supposed to be the American dream in motion. Star athlete, movie star, corporate spokesman. A man who broke barriers in sports and entertainment and was, for a time, universally admired. He didn't just transcend racial boundaries. He actively distanced himself from them, preferring to be seen as O.J. rather than a symbol of anything larger. People saw him on television, smiling in suits, running through airports for rental car commercials. He was everywhere. He was safe. And then, suddenly, he wasn't. When Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were found murdered in 1994, the media landscape convulsed, and at the center of it all was O.J., not as a grieving ex-husband, but as the suspect. The white Bronco chase was the moment when the O.J. myth shattered. America watched in real time as one of its most famous faces became its most infamous fugitive. News helicopters followed from above. Crowds gathered on overpasses. Nobody blinked. Nobody turned the channel. The trial that followed was nothing short of a spectacle. A courtroom turned into a battleground for race, celebrity, and justice. The prosecution had DNA, motive, timeline. The defense had charisma, doubt, and the most famous glove in legal history. Millions watched every day. It wasn't just a case. It was entertainment, a national obsession. When the verdict came, not guilty, the country split. Some cheered, others raged, and in the middle stood O.J., still smiling, still insisting on his innocence, even as civil trials later found him liable for the deaths. What made Simpson terrifying wasn't just the crime. It was the collapse of an icon, the realization that fame doesn't protect, but it can deflect. That a man so loved, so familiar, could suddenly become a stranger. The O.J. case turned America into a mirror, forcing the country to stare at its fault lines: race, class, justice, celebrity. And when it was over, no one looked at football players or the legal system quite the same way again. And while Simpson stunned the world by falling from grace, the next figure arrived already surrounded by suspicion, not for her actions, but for the people she led into her orbit. 41. Tonya Harding. By association. Tonya Harding might be the only person on this list who didn't commit a crime, and still became a national symbol of fear, betrayal, and the chaotic underbelly of ambition. She wasn't supposed to be terrifying. She was supposed to be an underdog. A working-class girl from Portland, Oregon, rising through the ranks of a sport dominated by pearls, politeness, and private coaches. Harding had grit, athleticism, and, in the minds of many, the wrong background. She didn't glide across the ice like a ballerina. She launched herself like a rocket. She was the first American woman to land a triple axel in competition. And yet, the judges always seemed to see someone else. Then came the incident. January 1994. Nancy Kerrigan, Harding's top rival and Olympic teammate, was attacked after a practice session. A man struck her in the leg and fled. The story was surreal, like something out of a tabloid or a bad movie script. And it got worse. The attacker was linked to Harding's ex-husband, Jeff Gillooly, and her bodyguard, Sean Eckhart, two men who looked like they'd stumbled in from a different genre altogether. Tonya denied knowing anything. Repeatedly. Officially. But the suspicion stuck. The public didn't know what to believe. Was she involved? Was she naive? Was she just surrounded by buffoons with bad plans and worse execution? It didn't matter. The court of public opinion decided she was guilty by association, that her very proximity to the crime and her defiant, unpolished persona made her culpable. What terrified people wasn't just the attack. It was the idea that something so calculated could happen in such a polished sport, that competitors might be sabotaged not by skill, but by hired goons. It shattered the illusion of ice skating as a graceful, elevated world, revealing it as just another arena where ambition could get messy. Harding was banned for life from U.S. figure skating. Not for what she did, but for what she didn't stop. And if Harding's fall was built on loyalty to the wrong people, the next figure showed what happened when the wrong person was the star, and the ring was just a stage for barely contained chaos. 42. Mike Tyson. Early era. Mike Tyson didn't just fight. He erupted. In the late 1980s, Tyson was more than a boxer. He was a force, an undeniable, unstoppable, often unfathomable force. He entered the ring with the expression of a man not trying to win, but trying to erase you. Punches came fast. Fights ended early. Commentators barely had time to settle in before his opponents were face down on the canvas, blinking at the ceiling lights. He was the youngest heavyweight champion in history, a 20-year-old phenom who moved with the speed of a welterweight and hit like a freight train. His power was mesmerizing. His aura was mythic, and his presence, terrifying. There was something primal about Tyson. He was marketed as a brawler from the streets of Brooklyn who had been sculpted into a weapon. But it wasn't just the punches that made him scary. It was the feeling that no one was in control. Not his handlers, not his trainers, not even Tyson himself. Behind the gloves was a whirlwind of contradictions, shy and violent, vulnerable and volcanic, intelligent and impulsive. He could deliver poetic reflections on discipline and then explode with fury in the next sentence. There was always a sense that something was coiled too tightly. and when it snapped, people got hurt. By the early 1990s, the mythology began to crack. Legal troubles, public outbursts, an infamous press conference meltdown here, an incident with a reporter there. The aggression that thrilled fans inside the ring started spilling out into the world. And suddenly, the man who had once been a global icon of physical dominance became a walking warning sign. What made early-era Tyson terrifying wasn't just that he could knock you out in under a minute. It was that you never knew when the knockout punch might come, in or out of the ring. And while Tyson's rage was volcanic and visible, the next figure on our list concealed his until it was too late. A rising NFL star with a multi-million-dollar smile and a secret that turned locker rooms into crime scenes. 43. Aaron Hernandez. Aaron Hernandez had the kind of resume that makes sports documentaries practically write themselves. Star tight end, national champion, NFL success story, Super Bowl dreams. But what made his story terrifying wasn't how high he rose. It was how much darkness was waiting underneath. Hernandez played with intensity. On the field, he was physical, explosive, fearless. He had a reputation as someone who would run through a wall for a first down, and fans loved him for it. But off the field, stories started to swirl. Whispers of late-night outbursts, unsettling behavior, and a tendency to attract the wrong kind of company. At first, people shrugged. Boys will be boys. Athletes will be athletes. Just keep scoring touchdowns. But then someone went missing. In 2013, the body of Odin Lloyd, a semi-pro football player and acquaintance of Hernandez, was found in an industrial park. The investigation led back to Hernandez with stunning speed. Security footage, cell phone pings, surveillance from his own home. It wasn't just a slip-up. It was as if Hernandez had made no effort to hide anything at all. And that's what shook people. The casualness. The disconnect. Here was a man who had everything: wealth, fame, family. And yet, he seemed pulled by something darker. After his arrest, further investigations linked him to other unsolved incidents. Rumors that had once been dismissed as gossip now looked like warning signs. The trial was surreal. A man with a multi-million-dollar contract and a fan base was suddenly standing in front of a jury, stoic and silent. He was convicted of murder in 2015. But the story didn't end there. He was later acquitted in a separate double homicide case. Then, just as questions were beginning to be asked about his mental health, his past, and the potential impact of chronic brain trauma, Hernandez took his own life in prison. Later examinations confirmed he had advanced CTE, a degenerative brain disease linked to repeated head trauma. But the diagnosis didn't erase the damage. Aaron Hernandez became a symbol of duality, the mask of talent covering a troubled mind. A reminder that even on the biggest stages, some demons don't stay buried. And if Hernandez's fall was wrapped in confusion and contradiction, the next figure carried her darkness with old-world clarity, a quiet, deliberate poisoner who turned trust into something lethal. 44. Mary Bellows. Mary Bellows didn't leave behind manifestos. She didn't confess to some grand ideology or speak of voices in her head. She lived in 19th-century rural America, a place of modest homes, tight-knit towns, and long shadows. And in those shadows, people began to die. The deaths were quiet, slow, often preceded by strange symptoms and whispered suspicions. Bellows was a neighbor, a wife, a community member. People liked her, trusted her, which of course was part of the problem. Because when trust is weaponized, it's nearly impossible to stop. Bellows became known in historical records not for dramatic acts of violence, but for methodical ones. Cases involving her stretched across a small town. Strange illnesses that followed family disputes. Sudden deaths with no clear cause. In a world without modern forensics, the explanations were often guesswork. Bad water, disease, God's will. But as the body count grew, the pattern emerged. She was always nearby, always calm, always sympathetic. Poison, historians believe, was likely her method. Common, untraceable at the time, accessible through household supplies and local apothecaries. It was the perfect tool for someone who didn't need rage to destroy. Only opportunity. She wasn't charged in every suspected case. The legal system of the era was slow, inconsistent, and deeply hesitant to convict women of such crimes. There was something unthinkable at the time about a woman methodically ending lives. It didn't fit the cultural script. So suspicion became gossip, and gossip became legend. What makes Mary Bellows terrifying isn't how much we know, it's how much we don't. Her story survives in fragments, in second-hand accounts, and dusty trial transcripts. There's no dramatic confession, no tidy ending, just the lingering sense that beneath the surface of normalcy, something cold and calculating was at work. She's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a smile, offers you tea, and leaves you wondering whether that ache in your stomach is just nerves, or something far worse. And if Bellows poisoned her way through domestic life, the next figure made murder into a business model, with farms, funerals, and insurance paperwork stacked like trophies. 45. Belle Gunness. Belle Gunness was the kind of woman who inspired myths before the ink was even dry on the police reports. She arrived in the American Midwest in the late 1800s. A Norwegian immigrant with a tragic backstory, a steely gaze, and a quiet, no-nonsense demeanor. She married, settled down in LaPorte, Indiana, and started building a life that, on paper, looked entirely ordinary. But that paper trail would eventually lead investigators to something much darker, a pattern of death, disappearance, and deception that would shock the country. Gunness's story unfolds like a financial ledger written in obituaries. Husbands died, children died, suitors vanished. And somehow, Belle always emerged with an insurance check, a plausible excuse, and just enough grief to stay believable. She was, by all outward appearances, a woman plagued by bad luck. But bad luck doesn't dig that many graves. She ran personal ads in Norwegian-language newspapers, looking for hard-working, lonely bachelors. "Come to Indiana," she said. "Help me work the farm. Bring your savings. A fresh start." For many immigrants, that offer sounded like a lifeline, but for many, it was the last thing they ever responded to. What makes Belle Gunness especially terrifying is how businesslike her methods seemed. There was no grand philosophy, no performative madness, just a system. Identify a target, lure them in, eliminate the complication, and collect the reward. Her farm became a kind of reverse homestead. Instead of building new lives, it buried them. In 1908, the Gunness farmhouse burned to the ground. Investigators found bodies in the rubble, including what was believed to be Belle's. But questions lingered. The corpse didn't match her size. A woman who had eluded suspicion for so long had suddenly died just as things were closing in? Theories exploded. Some say she faked her death and disappeared. Others believe she died in the fire. What's certain is that dozens of bodies were unearthed on her land, many never identified. Belle Gunness may have been a pioneer, not of the frontier, but of a kind of predatory freedom that only a new country can offer. She turned hope into bait, and dreams into burial plots. And if Belle hid behind the promise of a better life, the next woman on our list made no such illusions. She was simply called the worst woman on earth. 46. Lizzie Halliday. Lizzie Halliday had a name that sounded like folklore, and a story that made even hardened 19th-century journalists lose their composure. She lived in New York State in the 1890s, drifting from town to town, always accompanied by rumors, strange accidents, and unexplained deaths. By the time newspapers began covering her story, she had already been linked to at least 5 suspicious incidents: fires, disappearances, sudden illnesses. But no one could quite pin her down. She was dismissed as eccentric, then unstable, then evil. It wasn't until police searched her home in Sullivan County that the real nightmare surfaced. Bodies buried in the yard, multiple victims, a husband, possibly more. And Halliday, when confronted, simply denied everything. Then changed her story. Then changed it again. Her trial was a spectacle, not just because of the charges, but because of her demeanor. Lizzie oscillated between confusion, laughter, and religious ranting. She claimed innocence, then offered bizarre explanations. At one point, she attempted to escape from her cell by sawing through the bars with a smuggled file. When that failed, she reportedly faked illness. She played every angle: madness, manipulation, martyrdom, and none of it seemed to work. What truly frightened people was how unpredictable she was. Doctors couldn't agree on whether she was insane. Journalists couldn't agree on whether she was guilty of more than what had been found. And the public couldn't agree on what to do with a woman who seemed completely unbound by morality or reason. She was the first woman in New York State to be sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted when she was declared mentally unfit, and she spent the rest of her life in an asylum. But even there, she caused fear. In one final, haunting twist, she reportedly killed a nurse during her incarceration. Lizzie Halliday became legend not just because of her crimes, but because of how impossible she was to explain. She didn't fit the mold of a criminal, a madwoman, or a schemer. She was all three, or none, depending on who was telling the story. And while Lizzie thrived on chaos, the next figure cloaked herself in calm, a landlady with a gentle smile and a checkbook full of secrets. 47. Dorothea Puente. Dorothea Puente didn't look like a threat. In fact, she looked like your grandmother. The kind who might grow roses in the backyard and insist you take a sweater when it's chilly outside. But behind her bifocals and floral print dresses was a mind that saw human life as a financial opportunity, and kindness as a weapon. In the 1980s, Puente ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California. Her tenants were mostly people on the margins, elderly, disabled, mentally ill, folks who had nowhere else to go and no one looking out for them. Puente made them feel welcome. She served home-cooked meals, managed their finances, helped them apply for benefits. And then, slowly, they began to disappear. At first, no one noticed. These were vulnerable people, often transient. But when a social worker pushed for answers about a missing client, the facade started to crack. Police arrived to ask questions. Puente smiled, served coffee, and insisted the tenant had simply moved away. But they decided to check the yard and found disturbed soil. Then the first body. In total, 7 were uncovered on the property. Later investigations suggested there may have been more, buried elsewhere, lost to time. Puente was arrested, tried, and convicted. But even during the trial, she maintained her innocence. She claimed the deaths were natural. The burials, misunderstandings. What made Puente chilling wasn't just what she did. It was how convincing she remained. She wrote letters from prison to pen pals around the world, presenting herself as misunderstood, maligned, even charming. Some believed her. She turned caretaking into predation, all under the guise of compassion. And that contradiction made her story endure, because no one expects the killer to be the one knitting scarves and baking muffins. Dorothea Puente left behind a quiet kind of horror, the realization that vulnerability can be exploited not just by monsters, but by those who claim to protect. And if Puente wore a mask of kindness, the final figure on our list didn't bother with disguises at all. A man whose presence made even seasoned investigators feel like they were staring into the abyss. 48. Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper wasn't a mystery, not in the conventional sense. He didn't spend decades hiding. He didn't leave cryptic letters or vanish into forests. In fact, when it was all over, he turned himself in, sat down, called the police, and calmly told them everything. That's what made him terrifying. At 6 feet 9 inches tall, Kemper was physically imposing, but his demeanor was disarmingly polite. He had a soft voice, a dry sense of humor, and the kind of conversational intelligence that made people lean in instead of back away. Even police officers who interviewed him after his arrest admitted they found him articulate, even likable, which, in retrospect, made the truth harder to stomach. Kemper's crimes in the early 1970s cast a long shadow over California. His victims were often hitchhikers, a common way to travel at the time. He didn't look threatening. He seemed safe, helpful even. He spoke to people as if he cared about what they had to say. And that trust, that thin, crucial moment of assumption, is what he used to gain access to their final moments. What made Kemper different wasn't just the scale of his crimes. It was the psychology behind them. After his arrest, he gave detailed interviews explaining his thoughts and methods with clinical detachment. He didn't boast. He didn't cry. He analyzed, as if he were a professor reviewing the case of a stranger. And yet, this wasn't a man without history. Kemper had already served time as a teenager, institutionalized after a violent act that most people believed would have predicted the rest. But he convinced psychiatrists he was reformed. He was articulate, intelligent, cooperative. They let him out early. The system didn't just fail to stop him. It handed him a second chance, and didn't ask the right questions before doing so. Even seasoned investigators admitted that Kemper's case haunted them, not just because of the crimes, but because of how lucid he was, how he could describe horror with the tone of someone discussing the weather. He didn't hide in shadows. He was the shadow, the one sitting calmly in the passenger seat, asking you how your day was going. And with that, the list ends. 49 figures whose lives twisted into legends, whose names left bruises on the American psyche. But before we close the door, a final thought lingers. Because none of these stories are really about monsters. They're about people, and how terrifyingly thin the line is between the ones we fear and the ones we trust. And that line? It's still moving.